Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I'm joined once again by my dude Brandon DaCruz for the body part specialization series, digging into part two here. Part one was so interesting. Great chat. Again, it was great to be back on the mics with you, dude. And so much that I wanted to dig into there that again we weren't intending for this to be a two-part series, but kind of ended up that way. As you said afterwards, like I should have probably expected that. But I'm
Absolutely.
excited to get into this. Before we get into the topic, anything else you want to say or throw out there?
No, I will say that I was quite happy and also taken aback. A lot of your listeners that were used to our old podcast, they were overjoyed to hear us back on the mic. I think a couple people thought that this was actually a throwback podcast that you were like repurposing because we actually did do a specialization cycle podcast in 2022. I believe it was in June of 2022. So I just reached out to them and I let them know that these are my updated thoughts because I think a lot of people in our space have an issue with really admitting or even coming forth and saying, "Hey, I do this different now," or
Yeah,
"My thoughts on this have changed," because in some people's mind, I don't see it as such, but they're essentially saying, "Hey, I was wrong then," but I really see coaching as well as scientific communication and then also information dissemination as an evolving practice. That coaching is a practice, meaning that we get better at it over time. And we should have the leeway to change our thoughts, change our perspectives, and also adjust and alter our models and our methods. And that's the beauty of coaching. I've been doing this 15 years and not one single, year has been the same. So, Jeremiah, we worked together for 2+ years. If you came back and worked with me again now, the things that I'm doing in terms of a nutrition training supplementation perspective are very much altered from the way that I coached you then. And that's a beautiful thing. So I want people to come into this and listen to the series in an open-minded fashion. It's not that some of the information I may have presented before is not correct or would not work. It's that with another 3 years of digging into literature, really getting up to date with the consensus of the research, and then also what's most important is applying it in practice and working with a really large breadth of individuals, whether that be athletes, that be competitors, or even general population clients. I've really altered and I've adjusted the methodology that I utilize. And what we really have to come back to is this is all about principles first. And it's not about protocols. This is about taking scientific principles and principles that we see in practice that work and adjusting it and really catering it towards the clientele that we're working with.
absolutely. It's almost like your training, your execution on a movement or like your
Mhm.
intensity in the gym, right? Like you think it is good 1 year, a couple years
Yes.
later, it will probably be completely different. It will be much improved. And that's the beauty of this as well. It's always evolving. There's nothing wrong with your thoughts when things evolving either. Or with being wrong, because that's like I
Mhm.
think people are so scared to like be wrong on social media. But it's like if you are cool, you learn something, you got better as a coach, right? It's like not
Absolutely.
that big of a deal. Okay, cool. Let's get into this before we get on too much of a tangent here. So we were kind of talking through programming architecture where we left off. We talked
Mhm.
through the idea that, hey, we probably want to be, we can't specialize in our entire body at once, right?
Mhm.
We probably want to choose like a larger muscle group and a smaller muscle group, or maybe one larger muscle group. We were discussing frequency and how
Mhm.
much that varies muscle group by muscle group. So, unless there's anything else you want to add there, are you good to talk through exercise selection?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Cool. All right. So, what does exercise selection typically look like here? Because I think that recovery is one of the biggest aspects we talked about, how important managing that is.
Mhm.
So, what does exercise selection typically look like here to ensure we're recovering well?
Yeah, so when I'm designing a specialization phase for a client, exercise selection is one of the most important aspects that I look at from a programming perspective, and it comes after volume and frequency. So really the guiding principle that I use in terms of exercise selection is the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Because if we're increasing volume, frequency, and then the total stimulus for a lagging muscle, we cannot load that muscle with movements that create a ton of systemic fatigue or joint and connective tissue stress. That's a big thing that I'm very much into looking into because I am working with a population that is now older than I was years ago. So my average client right now, I looked at the stats that I have on my back end, and they're 47 years old. By no means is that old, but when I was in the gym working with 25 and 30-year-olds, it's a much different training life course as well as they have not or they have accumulated a lot more wear and tear. So really what we want is that the target tissue be the limiting factor in a movement, not your low back, not your grip, and not your joints. So personally, what I do when I'm looking, I kind of look at this through a framework. So when I'm Looking for movements, I'm looking at movements that load the muscle through a measurable and meaningful range of motion, those that allow for stable, repeatable execution, those that limit systemic fatigue. And it's not that fatigue is like this boogeyman that we have to avoid at all costs, but if there's a movement that isn't going to put undue fatigue on you and you can easily do an alternative, I would rather go for one that we can get a greater stimulus and less fatigue out of. And then I really want that movement makes the target muscle the clear limiter. So what I will do oftentimes is I'll minimize heavy axial loaded barbell variations unless they're absolutely necessary, or if that person is incredibly technically proficient at them. I have worked with some former powerlifters and honestly, some former like weightlifters that were really good and technically proficient at the back squat. So that is something that we utilize in their programming, but it's because of their actual biomechanics and their actual technique at it. But in generality, I'm going to limit those heavy axial loaded barbell variations. I'm going to limit movements that beat up connective tissues, especially when they're done multiple times a week. And that's actually one area that my mind or my thoughts have changed on, not repeating the same movement, especially the same exercise. And that's something that a mentor of mine, Chris Beardsley, I worked with him many years ago. He's very into repeating movements, the same movements. So if it's a incline barbell press, he will do that multiple times. He does like an ABA split. So he will repeat that, say, if he's doing a 3 day per week full body training program, he will repeat that, say, I'm just going to give a hypothetical Monday and Friday. I've seen in practice that that does not work well, especially for people that have predisposition or susceptibility, connective tissue issues, or joint and tendon issues. And then I'm also looking to minimize exercises where coordination or stability becomes a bottleneck instead of the muscle. And so these are kind of like a framework that I look at things. And then obviously there's an intake process. There is a discussion process with the individual that we're working with and looking at their training history, what movements have and have not worked well for them. But in totality, I'm kind of looking at it from a principle-based perspective and saying, how can I get the most amount of stimulus in that target musculature with the least amount of undue and unnecessary fatigue?
Okay, okay, very well put. I really like the concept of stimulus to fatigue ratio as well, and I think it's very important to consider here, right? Let's say that you do a set of back squat, a set of hack squat, and let's say you are that person who performs that back squat extremely well. Not that it's a bad movement, but still we have a lot more additional fatigue accrued with the axial loading we get from it, than we might get from a hack squat. So we get better stimulus relative to the fatigue from the hack squat potentially.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a very important concept here. Let's kind of get into then a concrete example of like what this might look like across the week. So let's say I come to you, I'm like, Brandon, I want to build my glutes. I want to be caked up this summer. Talk me through like from an exercise selection what this might look like, because I'm curious there. I think when people think of glutes they typically think like, okay, we're going to do like our back squats, we're going to do our lunges,
Mhm.
but all those are more linked and biased movements as well typically, which are going
Yes.
to be a little bit more fatiguing. So talk us through what this might look like.
All right, so I'm going to go back to that concept of stimulus fatigue ratio. Really, what I'm
Mhm.
looking is to minimize, say, central and systemic fatigue. And I'm really looking at local fatigue because we do want to have fatigue in that specific muscle. So in your case, it's going to be the glutes. So when we really think about the glutes from a muscle architecture perspective, that's a large systemically demanding muscle group. It's a very large, a lot of times I find it almost ironic. A lot of times when people talk about glute training, it's almost like an add-on that they're just going to add on almost what we would refer to as tax-free volume. But if you actually look at the glutes from a muscle architecture perspective, they are capable of taking on an immense amount of load. And with that higher degree of load is going to come more fatigue essentially. So for
Mhm.
glute specialization, I don't build that training week around heavy barbell squats or RDLs, especially not doing so multiple times a week, which is something that I have seen utilized in other people's specialization programs, other coaches' programs, and people have come to me having utilized those. But then they have a bunch of issues that have come as a result. They haven't actually been able to utilize a specialization cycle to the best of their ability or for a longer enough time course to really see the benefits of it. So, in their opinion, it was ineffective, but it's really because it wasn't constructed well. So, I utilize what I refer to as a mixed model. So, I'm going to give you like a hypothetical of like how I look at these days because a lot of times with glute training, I'm going to do, especially for women, that is their number one priority. I'm going to do that 3 days a week. And so one day is going to be a heavy and stable day. So that's going to be what I refer to as a heavy loading day, which is an approach I got from one of my mentors, Dr. Scott Stevenson. He has a programming ideology or philosophy called fortitude training, and he has certain movements which are loading movements. And so I'll usually utilize one of a few variations. So it could be like a hip thrust or a glute bridge variation. it could be a leg press with a glute bias, or it could be a step up or split squat variation. And within that, in that first day, we're really going to focus on loading. So it could be lower rep ranges and really focusing on maximizing progressive overload within those movements. Then on the second day, and now this is not in actual order, so this could be interchanged based on that person's schedule. So it doesn't mean because I said day one that it's going to be day one, day two, day three, or
Right.
say Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We could interchange these and it could be like an undulating periodization. But another day is going to be focus on more lengthened work. We're going to focus on that deep stretch mediated hypertrophy and high mechanical loading. So that could be something like an RDL or a dumbbell hinge variation. That could be a Bulgarian split squat, or that could even be something like a cable pull through. And then on the other day, so the third session or the last session is going to be more of an isolation day with higher reps. So I'm going to do things like hip extensions, machine kickbacks, or even machine abduction. And really, when it comes down to it, when you look at the construction or this principle based perspective, that heavy barbell or dumbbell hinge work might only be once a week. But the rest of the days that we train the glutes, I'm using more stable glute dominant work that doesn't crush the spine. It doesn't have a lot of axial loading. It's not going to crush their CNS. And it's not going to, like I've been alluding to, cause undue fatigue, which is going to impair their ability to recruit and really stimulate that muscle the next week or the next session.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So it sounds like we have stability as a whole is larger priority. And again, kind of ties
Mhm.
into the principles you talked about with exercise selection before. We have 2 days where we are challenging the length and range a bit more, and then one day that is a lot less fatigue in terms of the volume that we're accruing with like more short and biased movements. You said kind of like a kickbacks, abduction type movements
Yeah.
potentially, correct?
So we're kind of looking at. I used to say this. I remember us having conversations, and this was like a thing from Cass, but actually I was utilizing this even before I was familiar with the work of N1. And this came from Alan Kress, who I worked with personally, and
Oh
was
yeah,
someone that was on the ground floor essentially of N1. And it was we used to look at movement selection from a 70% lengthened bias perspective and a 30% shortened bias perspective. So if you actually
I
think
like
about how
that.
I constructed the days, it's actually a 66-33% distribution. 66% is going to be somewhat of an exposure in that lengthened deep stretch position, and then 33% are going to be in the shortened position. So that's just a good amount. That's a good distribution of very stimulative. Like when you look at lengthened movements, it's not the lengthened portion in and of itself that you have to just do that, but taking the muscle through a full contractile range, which includes the lengthened portion of the movement, is going to provide a robust stimulus for hypertrophy. And then we can also get more of the shortened bias work. And I really like that, not only from like from a joint and connective tissue perspective, and also just taking that muscle through a full range of motion, but also I utilize those days to really develop a very high mind to muscle connection. I really want them to connect with that muscle. So that's actually the only day that I'll really be telling clients or I'll have feedback or cues where I'm looking for sensation in those movements. I don't really expect in a dumbbell hinge variation, say, or in a RDL, I don't need them to feel their glutes and hamstrings the whole time or feel the most robust squeeze because they're not going to. It's a lengthened bias movement. But in something like a kickback, you should be feeling a deep contraction, especially in that shortened position.
I think that's a very important takeaway, actually. I get that a lot with glutes specifically. It's like, hey, I don't feel like this split squat or this
Mhm.
RDL in my glutes. And people like, should I drop weight and really focus on feeling it more? And it's like, no, don't worry. If we're executing the movement properly, we're driving tension there, but we will
Yes,
always get more sensation and more short bias movements.
absolutely.
So I think that's important. I think that is one where like your length and bias movements, people get too focused on sensation. Okay, so great example of a larger muscle group. Let's say we're talking side delts here.
Mhm.
Does the architecture of this look drastically different?
It somewhat, I will say that. So how I approach delts, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of an extended um, I guess, case study because we discussed that delts are one of the muscle groups that I will utilize a higher frequency with. So we're going to
Mhm.
utilize a 4 day type of approach because that is something that I've utilized with great success with a lot of athletes, especially something like their side delts, which they've never felt soreness in. There's not a lot of damage that's incurred by that muscle group, and they're not having overlapping indices of impaired recovery that are also costing them performance on other movements. And so with delts, they recover quickly and they don't load the spine heavily. So frequency and exercise variety can be higher. So what I like to look at this is I have a few different days that I construct within my programming. So I'll have like a mechanical tension focused day. So this could be something like dumbbell or machine overhead press. I usually will like to use like an high interior delt press with either dumbbells or on a spin machine. But if I am trying to get more of that side delt, I will actually utilize different variations of an upright row. That is actually an exercise that I think is massively underrated and something I utilize in a lot of my programming. Then I'm going to go to another day, which is going to be more isolation for either the middle delt or the posterior delts or the rear delts, because that is another area that I find to be a really lagging muscle group on a lot of people. And if you're able to get that three-dimensional, it's just a great look from the side when you actually have the
Hmm.
three-dimensional image from the building that musculature in the rear delts. A lot of people have overly dominant interior delts, and then also because of their posture, they're kind of slumped forward. So you see more of that, but a lot of people could benefit from doing rear delts. So in the second day or one of the sessions, it's going to be more isolation focused. So that could be machine lateral raises or something like a rear delt fly. Then I'm going to have another day, which is going to be higher rep work, which I refer to as pump work. And that's going to be something like a cable lateral, a dumbbell lateral, something that we can get into a higher rep range. And generally, that's going to be anywhere between 15 to 30 reps. I really want them to connect with that muscle, flood it with metabolites, and not that metabolites in and of itself are a driver of hypertrophy. It's very interesting. There was literally just a review that came out looking at the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy that was disputing metabolic stress as an independent driver of hypertrophy. But here's the thing, I just had the researcher on yesterday on my podcast. We cannot disentangle mechanical tension and metabolic stress because when you have high degrees of loading on a muscle fiber, you will accumulate metabolites like lactate, hydrogen ions, phosphate, and things of that sort. So I like utilizing that just so they have a feel of that muscle and get a mind to muscle connection. And then oftentimes, if I'm utilizing a fourth session that I'm going to hit some side of the delts, I'm going to utilize like a touch-up session. So that's going to be either another day of a stable exercise like machine laterals, or I'll do like a rear delt cable fly. And so if you see, most of these are isolation movements. Most of these aren't incurring great degrees of fatigue. And besides like the dumbbell interior or high interior press or the upright row, the degrees of loading that you're actually taking those muscle fibers and that those muscles through is quite limited. So you're not going to incur a ton of damage, a ton of stress onto joint connective tissue as well as from a systemic perspective. So it's not like it's accumulating so much fatigue that you cannot do 3 to 4 sessions of hitting those muscles on a frequent basis.
I like that. No, I really like that. And I've done something quite similar. I find delts are pretty easy to kind of just naturally work in, even if you have someone doing like a 4 day upper lower split. Like, hey, we might start our end or lower body sessions with like a side delt or rear delt
Yes.
movement. And then maybe our primary delt movement on our upper body days is a press, like a high incline press or a shoulder press. It does work out quite
Mhm.
well. Okay. Okay. So I think that's
I want to hit one thing in addition to that because a lot of people may not think outside of the box, but I actually do find that utilizing weak point training on a day that really wouldn't seem like it would fit is actually quite advantageous. So one thing that I really like to do is if it's either arms or delts, I will start a lower body session with that because they're not going to incur a ton of fatigue doing that. So say that someone has lagging biceps and we're utilizing a higher frequency approach, but they're only training 4 days a week. I do not want to make every single session, every single upper body session, just start with biceps where it's a priority principle. But I can start, 2 of those lower body days with bicep focused work. Or the same thing as you just alluded to, the dumbbell or the side lateral or the side delt work prior to a lower body day. It's something that isn't going to take away from your actual heavy, lower body work, but it's a way to get an extra stimulus in where it doesn't have a crossover effect to what you're doing after in that session. So it's not something that we have to worry about taking away from a session, but it is an additive stimulus that we can add in to really isolate as well as stimulate that muscle group that we're looking to bring up.
I really like that as well. I start my one of my lower body days. I start with biceps and triceps, and I've done that. I think I started doing that with you actually, and I have
Yeah.
always really enjoyed that because it is a good like. It doesn't seem like it really makes the lower body session take longer. You're
Mhm.
very fresh going into that, a lot fresher than typically like people are gonna put their like bicep
Assume, yeah.
tricep work at the end of an upper body session typically, which might not be the best depending on there. We could argue that either way,
Mhm.
but I do really like to structure things like that as well. So, let's talk intensity. How hard, when we're looking at the muscle groups that we're specializing in, how hard do we want people to push, or are we scaling intensity back as frequency increases?
This is a very interesting question. I'm going to go through some of my thought processes and my framework, and then I would love to get your thoughts and us to go back and forth on this because we cannot just go based off what suggestions would be. We also need to discuss what we actually see in practice and why we may be actually programming things closer to failure than maybe some experts on the internet that don't really work with people would suggest, but we are doing so to be able to encourage and kind of, coerce or push our clients towards actually training intensely enough. So really when it comes down to it, intensity needs to be high during specialization, but it also should be managed intelligently. So this will depend on the client themselves, but I have a framework that I use to conceptualize this. So first, most sets are going to land between 1 to 2 reps in reserve across the course of a mesocycle. So when I say that, it means on average, from the start of the mesocycle to the end of the mesocycle, when I look at the amalgamation and I back calculate what was the average reps in reserve for that specialized muscle group, generally falling within 1 to 2 reps in reserve. But I do want to make a very important caveat. I'm talking about a true 1 to 2 reps in reserve, which means that with some clients, I will tell them that they're training at 0 reps in reserve because their 0 reps in reserve sets tend to really be 1 rep in reserve and this is really where coaching psychology comes into play. So this level of intensity keeps effort high and drives hypertrophy without causing the kind of excessive fatigue that tanks performance later in the week. So really when I look at it, I like to err on the side of like 1 rep in reserve with many of my clientele for specialized muscle groups. But I'm also looking at training video feedback to ensure that it's 1 rep in reserve. So with some clients, they're going to hear me right now that I said 1 rep in reserve and we have, a dialogue back and forth and they're saying, Brandon, you constantly push me to 0 reps in reserve. Well, I'm doing that to ensure that you're close enough to failure to actually get a great stimulus. Another thing is I look at failure as a tool. I strategically program some sets to 0 reps in reserves. And usually it's going to be on the final set of the day. A lot of times with isolation movements, I'm taking them all to the house with clients. And I do that a lot on machine-based work as well. I really do think that in order to know what a true 1 to 2 reps in reserve is, you need to take yourself to the point of failure, like true concentric muscle failure, really where you have literally nothing left in the tank. Because as with anything, if it's a great analogy to this is nutrition tracking. If you want to eventually say, quote unquote, and I hate this term, intuitively eat, which is a misconception of the word itself, but if you want to have what I would refer to as goal-directed eating, where you don't have to measure every single thing, but you're making choices and decisions that are in alignment with your body composition goals, you should be tracking first, weighing and measuring every single thing you eat so you know you have the knowledge and the experience with what an adequate and appropriate portion size is for a specific goal. I see the same thing with training. It's a practice. The longer you train, the better you get at this if you're doing things in an optimized and appropriate fashion. Then I do think that intensity must scale with volume or with frequency. And actually, I see it as like a whole conjunctive thing. So I think that when we look at it, we have to consider the intensity recommendations we make based on someone's volume and their frequency. So the more times a week we train a muscle, the more volume I'm most likely going to have someone do. So in that case, intensity needs to be modified. So what I'll say is this: if I have someone training twice per week or a muscle twice per week, I'm gonna have them do more hard sets to or near failure. Now, if you're training something 3 to 4 times a week, especially if it was something that was larger like the glutes, there needs to be more undulation in terms of the rep range and proximity to failure. And I'm usually going to have clients target mostly 1 to 2 reps in reserve on compound movements and then 0 to 1 rep in reserve on isolation movements. So I like to think of relative intensity like a dial, not a switch that we turn it on and off. The higher the frequency, the more strategically you have to place the all out sets. But I will say that a lot of times the best bet, the best suggestion I can make from a coaching application perspective is to really look at the literature and then also look at what your clients are most comfortable with. If we think about it, we do not have to program every single week at the same reps in reserve, nor every single movement. So I actually like an undulation of utilizing, say, 1 to 2 reps in reserve on compound movements because we know from a motor unit recruitment perspective, as well as from an actual literature perspective, when we look at the Robinson meta-regression, a meta-analysis on failure training, we see that in lower rep ranges with compound movements, above, say, like 77.5% of 1 repetition max, which is like 8 or 9 reps, we're able to get as sufficient of a stimulus going 0 to 1 to 2 reps in reserve as 0 reps in reserve. So I think that we can reserve some of our higher reps in reserve training, so 1 to 2 reps in reserve for compound movements that are going to be more demanding. And then for isolations, I really like to utilize that as like kind of like a shit tester. Like, let's get some practice in, let's take it to the house, really push yourself to show yourself what you have in the tank. And I also find that that's not only great from a hypertrophy perspective, but also from a mental resilience perspective. I find that a lot of clients that have never truly been pushed by a coach, they're able to gain so much both from a physical and a mental perspective by having someone they respect say, listen, I understand that you think you're training hard and you are pushing yourself, but you have so much more in the tank and you're capable of so much more. I want you to unlock that. That doesn't mean we have to do it every single set of every single session of every single week, but I do need you to take yourself to that place to know what you actually have and what you're capable of.
I fully agree. I feel like that's what I've said for most of this podcast, but that's very similar to how I do things. I for sure don't think we always need to take everything to failure. I think that around like one RIR on average is probably a very good spot. And I think that especially for like our compound movements, if someone is truly able to take that to failure, I would probably prefer most of the time we're at one RIR. As you said, maybe the last set, like cool, make sure we can get there. But I find very few instances in application where a client is actually like, dude, we're failing and you're like pushing too hard way too often. I think of like one client,
Yes.
I have a kid from New Zealand. He's only like 20. He's a coach himself. And he's actually someone where it's been like technique is pretty good. And dude will like push and can just grind out these reps where it's like he's convulsing and it was like, okay, here we were actually progressing worse. And he was also like his biofeedback was really poor. We were
Mm.
struggling to progress. He was feeling like shit. We actually by me, okay, dude, I want you to try to aim for like two RIR rather than one. Okay, now he's leaving one rep in the tank and suddenly we're
Yes.
progressing better. Right. But for most people, like I will almost always program like 0 to 1 RIR on
Mhm.
our isolations. And then like, hey, our compound movements, depending on what we're doing, we're probably doing aiming for like 1 to maybe 2 on like an RDL, just speaking in generalities. And again, it's very rare that I'm seeing like we're pushing this too far. A lot of times as well, like I think you work with a little bit more advanced population than I do still. Like I think that even for myself, like something that I've realized in the last couple of years is I'm not nearly as advanced as I thought I was like 3 years ago, right? Like you think of like your client Wes, right? I think like that's probably someone where as you ramp up his volume, you probably do have to be a lot more cautious with intensity. Where like a lot of times I am ramping up volume because the intensity is lacking. And so we're kind of trying to compensate for this in another manner. So I don't know if I have anything to really add. That was kind of word salad, but I think
No,
we're on the
I,
same
I
page with
definitely
everything
agree
there.
with where you're coming from. I do think that when I come onto a podcast, even when I speak on my own, I know that a lot of people that are listening are those in the general population. I've worked with a lot of IFBB pros and then also natural pros. And just from my conversations and consultations with them, I realized that that is not the audience that most tunes into podcasts. A lot of these guys have a lot of this stuff figured out and they more need guidance and kind of a soundboard to like bounce ideas off of. So a lot of the coaching that I've done at a very high level, I am giving them directives, but it's a very much collaborative relationship because a lot of them know their body so well and they have very specific things that they like to do and have had success doing. However, when we're talking in a general, manner and we're talking to an audience, I realize that I may have done like a disservice years ago when I first started getting on podcasts, say like 2019 and 2020, because I used to be so big on talking about recovery and talking about obviously there was many aspects of things I was talking about, but when it came to training, I was always diving into recovery. And then I realized that there were so many people that were listening to the podcast conversations that I was having and the content that I was putting out that they weren't under recovered. They were understimulated. So they didn't need any more recovery. If they were training 3 days a week, most of their week was recovery. So then I realized I have to push more on the stimulus side, but it really is knowing your audience first and foremost, and then knowing your clientele. There are very few people that I worked with at this point that I really have to pull back. Now there are some, and those are people that I know very well inside and out, and I know what their biofeedback looks like and what indicators necessitate me stepping in and pulling back the reins. But most people do not have like a long training history in terms of really pushing themselves hard, nor a lot of people that we're working with. I used to work with people that had a really long training history in another sport where they were an MMA fighter, they were a collegiate football player, they played a high level athletics, but that's not the average person. If we actually look statistically, 17.1% of people in industrialized countries are actually meeting the aerobic and the resistance training guidelines, which is 150 minutes of low intensity or low to moderate vigorous level activity in terms of aerobic training and 2 to 3 muscle strengthening sessions a week. So a lot of people we're talking to, they have never pushed themselves hard enough. And sometimes we as a coach, whether someone wants to hear it or not, you need to do more. You need to push yourself harder and you really need to find that limit. And that's something that having that hard conversation and really expressing to them. I had a conversation with a client that I'm taking through a quadricep specialization cycle this week, and she's an advanced trainee and she also coaches others. And I had to have a conversation with her like, Hillary, I understand that this is boring and I understand that this is grueling, but you are at the precipice of being able to get to that next level physique. You've never pushed yourself this hard because you hadn't anticipated that you were already at this level. And I'm telling you that based on the gains and the biofeedback and the response that I've seen in your body the last 7 months, you were actually intermediate. So I need you to push. It's not going to be forever, but we really need to dig deep and keep pushing throughout this mesocycle. And then we can pull back because muscle is far harder to gain than it is to maintain. Once you've gotten to a very high level, it's pretty easy to maintain that tissue. But to really get there from being at an intermediate level to a very high level of advancement, Jeremiah, we put like 20 something pounds on you throughout our time working together, but I
A
pushed the
good
fuck out of
time.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I pushed you hard because
Oh
that
yeah.
was what was needed to get to that next level. You came in, you were very experienced, you're an intelligent guy, you know what you were doing. And it's like, how am I going to get this person to the next level? Obviously, from a nutrition supplementation perspective, that was the first thing I went to work at because we went into a mini cut and then a fat loss phase initially. But when it came to training him, you actually had sufficient fuel on board. I was pushing you week in and week out because that was what was needed to get your physique to that next level. And now you're someone carrying a ton more tissue than you did when you first came to me. So these are lessons. This is not that you have to do this forever. And just like with that being said, a specialization cycle is a short term phase that is utilized to accelerate and to enhance progression. But this is not something I would utilize year in and year out.
Perfect. I think all that is very, very well put. Okay, so from there, let's talk bigger picture. First, digging into non-priority muscle groups. So, what type of progress should someone expect for their non-priority muscle groups during these phases? Like, are we just maintaining, or is some growth here still realistic?
Yeah, I think it's really going to depend on the person, but I think what it's really important to realize is that when we enter a specialization phase, the expectation for non-priority muscles needs to shift. So you need to go into this. This is something that a conversation that I have with clientele. We're not trying to grow everything at once. We're reallocating the body's limited resources, both from a recovery and adaptive perspective, to the muscles we want to bring up. So really, when it comes down to it, for priority muscle groups, the goal is maintenance, not immense progression. So when I really think about it, we want to realize that we want to maintain and slightly, we can in certain contexts, you could slightly increase or slightly improve those muscle groups, but that is not the intention. We are purposely backing off to maintenance volume to be able to enhance the growth of other muscles. Now, the good news about that is that maintenance volume is much lower than maximal growth volume, especially for trained lifters. So if we actually look in the literature, and I remember years ago we discussed this, but there was research that showed that trained individuals can maintain muscle with as little as 1/3 of their usual training volume as long as relative intensity stays relatively high. So during a specialization phase, what I do instead of using 1/3, I will go slightly above. So I may be utilizing, say, 2/3 of someone's volume, or say 50% of their volume to be able to not only maintain, but get a little bit of a growth stimulus. So for most muscle groups that are not priorities during a specialization phase, I'm going to train them between 6 to 10 hard sets per week, which is more than enough stimulus to keep them from losing size or strength. Now, depending on how dialed in someone is, the body parts we're not specializing on can still grow a bit, but really only that's going to occur if their maintenance work is done of a very high quality, if they're in a calorie surplus, if their sleep quality is high and their stress is managed well. But the goal really isn't to grow these body parts at the same speed as specialized muscles. We're purposely lowering volume to be able to free up recovery bandwidth so the priority muscle can take off. So I really, when I explain this to clientele, because I'm sure you get this, Jeremiah, if you take clients through specialization phases, many people are not satisfied with just bringing up two muscles. Like initially it sounds great. And then they're like, but how about this? Like, can I add this? Or can we bring up this other muscle? And it's like, it's not going to work because if that was the case, we would have just utilized the balance program that we had previously, and you would have progressed those lagging muscle groups at the same rate as your other muscle groups. We're utilizing this strategy and this approach because you do have particular muscle groups that are weak and they're lagging in comparison to other muscles. So I really try to get it across to clients as we're looking at your weekly volume budget as we would managing a financial budget or an investment portfolio. During a specialization cycle, you reduce spending in the areas already doing well, meaning your strong muscle groups, so you can make a bigger investment in the areas that need the most improvement, which are your weak or your lagging muscle groups.
Absolutely. I will often get like let's say we're focusing on glutes and delts. I will often get man, my bicep curls, I've just been like at a very similar weight for the last couple of weeks now. That's okay.
Mhm.
That's not our priority. Like if that's coming up, sick, but it doesn't, or like my pecs, it doesn't, like my chest presses, it doesn't make sense for us to prioritize more of our recovery resources there, or more of our weekly, like the volume budget, as you put it, there at this time. So if we make progress there, sick, but we do have to be okay to a degree with a lot of things. Maybe we are just maintaining, and cool. We can specialize in that in the future if we want to go that route. But I think
Absolutely.
that's quite important to understand. From a nutritional perspective, how important is nutritional status here? Like, would you only implement this with someone actively in a building phase, or could we run this in like a mild deficit?
Yeah, so I'll be honest. Nutritional status is one of the biggest determining factors in whether a specialization cycle will work. So here's how I look at this from a conceptual like overview perspective. The best case scenario where I've seen the best results with clients is when I have them in a lean building phase and they're in a small calorie surplus. I want clients to go into each session well fueled so that they can thrive during a specialization cycle, as a high volume plus high frequency approach requires the fuel to have productive training sessions and the energy to enhance recovery capacity. So a surplus provides us with more fuel to use in training, better glycogen replenishment post training, better training performance and recovery from that training, and then lower diet fatigue. So if someone wants to make the most dramatic changes to a muscle group, I'll run a specialization cycle during a lean building phase, which is what I did specifically with you, and I'll have them in a small surplus to maximize their rate of adaptation. Now, if we look at the next tier, which is what I would call like a workable scenario, would be in maintenance calorie conditions. I have run specialization cycles at maintenance, but it necessitates that someone's protein intake is very high and they're dialed in. It's not someone that's like a macro Tetris dieter that's just looking at calories. Like, we really need to look at food composition and macronutrient distribution. I need to ensure that the recovery is solid and that the volume is well managed. So oftentimes within a maintenance condition specialization cycle, I might not increase volume to the same extent that I would in a surplus. But in these phases, the expectations need to be realistic that progress will be slower. So sometimes this is the right call for like lifestyle clients who don't want to go into a lean building phase, or they don't really want to push calories up, or for those who want to stay leaner year round and are willing to not make gains as effectively. But that's a conversation you need to have with a client. Like, listen, I know that you want to grow, take a woman, you want to grow your glutes and your delts, but if you're unwilling to gain any amount of body fat, even just like the residual fat that would come along with gaining muscle, you will be gaining less in terms of glute gains and delt gains, or we have to extend the cycle over a much longer time course. Now, the scenario I almost never use a specialization phase in is in a deficit, as that approach necessitates having sufficient resources, both from an energy and recovery perspective, and both of those are diminished in a deficit. So what I really try to get to across the clients is, if you ever notice how I used to transition you in and out of these phases, when you went into fat loss phases, I actually took you out of a specialization cycle approach, because it doesn't make sense. First of all, you're not going to get the outcome that you're looking for. Many times, most people are unable to grow in a deficit in and of itself. Now, to be able to think to yourself that you're going to grow your most lagging muscle groups in a deficit is almost like a fool's errand. And I also find that the specialization cycle approach really takes a big investment of your time, your energy, and your mental resources to really like gear yourself up for those training sessions. And oftentimes I feel like it would just set people up for disappointment, because they put all this energy and effort into, say, those one or two muscle groups, and they didn't see their return on investment. The other aspect of that is that we have newer literature that came out within like the last year or two. And I know this is something that Eric Helms had covered. I believe either we covered it off air on one of my podcasts, or maybe we covered it on the podcast itself. But there is essentially research looking at muscle reallocation, meaning that when someone is in a deficit, if they're not training a muscle group, but they're utilizing higher volume on another muscle group, they could essentially, the statement is rob from Peter to pay Paul. And what I mean by that
So,
is that this was in the context of a lower body training study. And I believe that the emphasis was on quadriceps. I could be mistaken, but I had the general concept correct. So they were training quadriceps, but they saw muscle loss in the calves, or maybe it was in the hamstrings. So we see that resources, remember, when you're in a deficit, your body's liberating fuel and pulling from different substrates or different energy reserves. So if you're in a deficit and you're not training all your muscle groups, or say that you're utilizing a specialization cycle approach where you're utilizing very low volume on muscle groups that are stronger and then very high volume on other muscle groups, there is the potential that you may be losing more muscle on specific muscle groups and only maintaining the muscle on the muscles that you're actually specializing in. So I do not think that this is an advantageous or any type of beneficial approach for utilizing specialization cycle techniques in a deficit.
that's super cool. I'm not even familiar with the concept at all. For sure, I'll have to dig into that more. That is very interesting and definitely makes sense. I mean, I feel like we recently were discussing how people sometimes not overvalue nutrition, but I think undervalue the importance of training for building a physique.
Mhm.
But I think that often in the context of like a specialization phase where we are in like maintenance or a surplus, a lot of times what I see and have to have this conversation quite often with clients, when someone is in a deficit, it's like we have 12 to 16 weeks, we're really dialed in. They are very intentional about their pre-workout nutrition
Mhm.
and like making sure their meal timing is quite good. But one area people often mess up in like a specialization phase where we are, let's say we're in a surplus, is hey, maybe we are like eating the food across the course of the day, but you're consistently like going into your training sessions dehydrated. You're not
Yeah.
doing a good job with your meal timing. And we have a lot of sessions where you're sending me videos that are like, oh, I just didn't feel very good this session because I was dehydrated, or like I forgot to eat my pre-workout meal. That is going to hurt our training quality, right? So training, of course, being the key for building muscle here, we have to consider how important fueling yourself well around your session for
Yes.
both recovery and the actual getting the actual stimulus is for getting the outcomes we want here.
Yeah, this can never be looked at. I've been doing a bunch of posts on this. We can never look at training or nutrition in isolation. The concept of periodization, a lot of people think of it conceptually from a training perspective, but as we've discussed over the years many times, that it is also about periodizing your nutrition. So the phases that you take yourself through, or I personally take my clients through, they're periodized, but both are paired together. So the nutrition programming and the training programming need to be paired together with the same goal in mind. So when the goal is to gain and maximize muscle tissue, especially in weak and lagging muscle groups that you have not been able to build in a balanced hypertrophy training approach, we need to ensure that every single card is stacked in your favor. We need to stack the deck in the best direction that can ensure that you're going to have you're going to be in the most advantageous position to gain muscle in those muscle groups. So really, when we think about it, a lot of people will not gain, especially in a significant deficit where they're trying to get very lean, they will not gain tissue. So to really have the concept, or to really expect that they're going to gain muscle in their weak body parts, if you actually look at it just from an anecdotal perspective, most people, it's the body parts that are lagging the most that they lose tissue from the most during fat loss phases. So say, for instance, you utilize an approach where you did bring up a specific muscle group. A lot of times those same muscle groups are what people notice when they go into a significant fat loss phase, is what they lose first. So I say this directly. A lot of women will say that they felt like they built their glutes, and I really see this in the context of not cementing those gains, meaning that they go right from a building phase where they're at their highest food intake, so they're glycogen replenished, they have very full round glutes, and then they go right into an aggressive fat loss phase. And it's almost like, hey, I gained all this muscle, but I lost it all during this fat loss phase. I think that it's a multifactorial problem. First, you were glycogen replenished, you're seeing a huge loss in water and glycogen, and also the fact that you really didn't stay at a substantially higher degree of muscle mass for an extended period of time and really cement those gains. You went from being at your peak of a building phase, you got your food up and you felt like, oh, my glutes look pumped most of the day, and now I'm going to go right into a fat loss phase, and maybe you took an aggressive approach. But really, when it comes down to it, if you are going to utilize a specialization cycle, it is something that is extremely intense and demanding, you should be putting every single vector. You should be turning up every single lever that you can to maximize your progress, including nutrient sufficiency, adequate energy availability, nutrient timing in terms of pre and post workout nutrition, supplementation that's going to aid you, whether that be pre-workout supplementation or intra-workout carbohydrates to help with the facilitation of better fueling and better recovery intra-session, and also reducing muscle damage. Then post-workout, ensuring that you're getting sufficient protein and carbohydrates for the remodeling and rebuilding process, and then ensuring that you're in an adequate state of energy availability across the day, so you're not going these long gaps of time without eating or utilizing a very short compressed window, or even doing the opposite where you're staying fasted in the morning and then stacking all your calories to macro hoard at night. This needs to be an optimized approach in all aspects if you want to optimize your gains. So I don't want to make any absolute statements, but I will tell you from a practical coaching perspective, I'm not running specialization cycles when people are in deficits.
I think that's a very good call. The idea of taking time to cement the gains that we've made. I heard Kubicella, and I think of somebody I heard talking about that recently, and it's never really an idea that I had considered before. I'll say, like, I just hadn't really thought about it or really even heard anyone talk about it, but it is something that I will say, thinking back on that, when I heard him discussing it, I was thinking of a few instances, and even like some instances with myself where I was like, I can see there being some merit to that. That's interesting. That's something I'll have to talk about with you more later. But
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we could, we could record so much in terms of the nutrition side of things. We've recorded many episodes in terms of like peri-workout nutrition, things of that nature. So let's talk about duration of a specialization phase. How long do you typically run a specialization phase before reassessing? Like, what are we kind of looking at in terms of signals that tell us it's time to shift focus?
All right. So this is something that I really want to share my own experience with. I actually went through my client case studies or case files on my computer prior to us doing this entire series, because I actually looked up some articles on specialization cycles and I found that they ran contrary to what I saw in practice. Now, these are mostly from content creators and influencers that were writing these articles, but a lot of people were talking about specialization cycles in the realm of like 5 to 6 weeks and then switching to another muscle group. And I have
never make sick progress in 5 to 6 weeks.
I have never found that to be the case. So I'm going to present what I've seen work in practice, and that might run contrary to what some people in your audience have heard, but I'll give you the justification behind it. So most specialization cycles run best for at least 12 to 16 weeks. And then oftentimes, if someone really has a priority body part that we want to bring up and really cement those gains and really ensure that they're making substantial and noticeable progress in, I may run 2 back-to-back 12-week cycles on that. Now, the reason I'm saying that this is an extended time course isn't to discourage you guys, but really it's because you have to realize that muscle growth is a slow process. So if you're truly going to build a noticeable amount of tissue, you need to spend enough time in a mesocycle to actually gain that tissue. So oftentimes how I look at this, I no longer utilize, and I haven't for a very long time, like pre-scheduled accumulation blocks into deloads, but just for the sake of this podcast, I think if we're utilizing a 16-week cycle, this could look hypothetically, if someone's biofeedback aligned perfectly, it could look like a 7-week training block with a 1-week deload and then another 7-week training block and deload. But that's just an example, because I will only deload a client in a reactive manner based on their biofeedback. So I've had many clients, including yourself, where I've run through a 12-week specialization cycle before we deloaded. Now, what I do is after 12 to 16 weeks, I will reevaluate their progress. And I'm doing that because I want to see what has worked well, what could we change, or what could we alter, or what could we improve upon. And then I also want to see if there's any indications that there's changes that need to be made, because in some cases I can run that same mesocycle. Say we went 12 weeks, I can run that again. But a lot of times what I'm doing is both from a physical and a mental perspective, I'm checking in with that client, seeing how they're enjoying this program first and foremost, but also, do you have any joint aches? Do you have any irritation? Do you have any excessive soreness? Do you have any movements that you really just don't feel like you connect with that we haven't really dug into throughout the time course of this phase? Now, I really want to make this clear. This is a collaborative process. So a lot of times with specialization cycles, there's alterations that need to be made throughout the course of that cycle. So 12 or 16 weeks doesn't mean you're running the same exact thing day in and day out. I'll say in Jeremiah's case, Jeremiah, you love different equipment. So oftentimes we're utilizing a very similar movement pattern in terms of the loading parameters, but we were utilizing different machines or different setups. And so really what I see is at least 12 to 16 weeks. I would not recommend, if you don't have that amount of time to devote to this type of approach, I would not recommend going into it.
Yeah, there was that stretch there where I was trying to find my new gym, and I think I changed gyms like 4 times in 3 or 4 months, and I still feel bad about that. I'm sorry, dude. Thank you for
Dude,
bearing with me through
no
that.
worries. I thought it was interesting. We got to experiment. I will say this. One of the best things, especially because we had a very close coaching relationship and we spoke not only through our check-ins, but every single week we got on a podcast together. It was a really good learning curve for different machines. And it was things that, especially when you were outfitting your home gym, these are still conversations that you and I had that I've helped other clients build out their home gyms based on the things that I learned through our coaching experience. So that was, something I look back fondly on.
The funny thing is, I have ended up right back where I started, where I go back to Fit Lab now. I'm just accepted, dude. Got to drive 30 minutes each way, and I'm good with it because
It's a great
it's
gym.
still just it is such a sick gym. Cool. I think all that's very important though, and I think that the time frame is very important as well. I think that with building muscle, it is so important to understand how long it takes. Like I know you said like, hey, probably minimum like 4-ish
Yes.
months. But really, like I think like if we want to see a significant change in a muscle, that's what I would say like, hey, minimum to start to see some shifts, we're gonna want at least like 4 to 6 months here if we're doing well. But like we're talking about you've completely changed how this muscle, like you've completely changed your appearance. This muscle completely
Yes.
looks different. Like we're talking someone who's been, might not be a specialization for this, but like let's say you want to completely change your glutes. Let's be real, like we're probably looking at like you spent like a good year and a half
Yes.
plus probably really learning how to train them well, prioritizing like all these different patterns where we're executing them well, we're pushing loading. And it's a long process, right? Now, again, it might not
100%.
mean specialization for the glutes the entire time, but that's like I think that's very, very important when we're talking about this is like specialization phases are such a sick thing. But again, it's not going to be like because you did this, it was 4 weeks and or
Yes.
the 5 to 6 weeks specialization and we completely morphed, right? It will still take a lot longer than we want typically. And like the clients who I've seen change their physiques the most, always the most impressive transformations are those people who it's been like, man, we spent a good like year plus
Absolutely.
outside of a deficit and just focusing on again it might not have been specializing in any one tissue but really focusing on fueling well and training hard, kind of an aside, but I think that is important here and a very good point you brought up.
No, I couldn't agree more. I
Cool.
think that it's especially important to just really clarify and really make people aware of the fact that muscle growth is such a slow process, especially if you're not a beginner. And I don't work with really any beginners at this point in my career. So for many people that I'm working with, they're intermediate and they want to become advanced. So they have several years in the gym and they've done macro tracking and things of that sort, but it really is dialing in all the details and really driving all of their habits, their behaviors, and their decisions towards things that are congruent with their goal and realizing that this is going to be a slow process, but you have to stay in it. You have to stay committed to it and realize that your patience is going to pay off. And I can't tell you how many clients that I've had, including yourself, that have invested the time, energy, and effort, and it's paid off immensely because they look dramatically different. And in that moment, it may seem like I want my dream body in 8 to 12 weeks. But for many of you, especially women, this is the biggest thing that I see with women. You do not have the requisite muscle to look the way you want to once you get lean. So yes, you could lose a significant amount of fat in say 8 to 16 weeks, but a lot of times you still do not have the shape and the toned musculature that you're looking for. And that's really where taking a dedicated time towards building muscle, towards fueling yourself sufficiently, whether that be at maintenance or in a slight surplus, and really letting go of the dieting mindset and stepping out of a mindset of restriction and subtraction into a mindset of abundance and addition can be so beneficial, both from a physique, but then also from a psychological perspective.
Absolutely. A lot of times I'll post like someone's fat loss transformation where we worked together for like a year and a half, 2 years. And it's like, okay, she did a 12-week fat loss phase and this is the result she got. And someone will like hop on a call. Hey, I want that. Can we get into fat loss? And it's like, okay, if you want that result, you want the result of that 12-week fat loss phase. You have to also want that like year and a half that she spent building prior, because that's really where the changes happen.
100%.
What would you say are the most common mistakes you see when someone's attempting a specialization phase on their own?
Yeah, so I see a lot of mistakes and I see them quite commonly. I think I've discussed this concept over many years. And so I find myself in conversations where people will tell me their own experiences with specialization cycles or their own, just in a consultation perspective, where I'm discussing someone's training history or their training approach. and I'm seeing certain commonalities. So the number one mistake is that many try to specialize everything at once. They will add additional volume to every body part, or another huge mistake that I see is people that take their existing training split and just add additional sessions onto it. And oftentimes this just leads to their total workload increasing without a substantial increase in any particular muscle, especially if they put themselves into a recovery debt. So we have to realize that I think people look at this without deductive reasoning. They just add more work because they think that that's going to yield the outcome that they want. But they first have to look at, is what I'm doing actually working? And do I have the recovery capacity to do more? Or do I need to take the current budget that I'm working with? If you're utilizing 85 working sets per week, you can't just go from 85 to 140 and just add in 2 or 3 more sessions. You have to look at, am I able to adequately recover from these 85 sets per week? Yes. Okay, maybe I can go up to 10 or 20%. I can go up to 95 or 100 sets. Or I could take the current volume budget that I have of 85 sets and just reallocate it differently rather than just stacking more work on top of work. Another mistake that kind of goes along with that is jumping volume too high and too fast. I've had many consultations with individuals that were initially doing, say, like 10 sets per muscle group and read something on specialization, or they read, one of the Schoenfeld studies that increased their volume from 10 to 30 or 45 sets overnight. And these people reenact that. So they go from 10 to 30 sets overnight, which honestly is just an injury waiting to happen, as that's a massive increase in what's called the acute to chronic workload ratio. And if you actually look at that term, acute to chronic workload ratio, it's been linked to increased injury risk. That's one of the biggest drivers of injury in both sport and resistance training outcomes. Another mistake that I see is not reducing volume for stronger muscle groups. And the reason this is so important is because if you do not create recovery bandwidth by reallocating and reshifting your current volume distribution, specialization is not going to work because you are currently not growing those weak muscle groups. So just stacking more work on top of those muscle groups and not adjusting anything else is just a poor programming approach. Another thing is poor execution on the target muscle. What I really try to get across to clients is we're working on quality first and quantity second, because more sloppy sets will not fix a lagging body part. It's the quality of the reps that matter more than the quantity. Another mistake that I see is using too many fatiguing exercises. And this was something we discussed previously with the stimulus to fatigue ratio. There's a lot of people that are utilizing specialization cycles where they have heavy squats or RDLs or heavy presses. They utilize a lot of barbell work, which in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that, but they're literally using those in every single session. And it's just impairing their recovery, and it's actually causing them to gain less than it is to gain more. And then also, this goes back to our nutrition conversation, is trying to grow a weak muscle group in a deficit. Really when it comes down to it, we're trying to create the most anabolic growth stimulus possible, but you need the resources to fuel that growth. So if you're in a catabolic condition, you're essentially you're shortchanging the amount of progress you can make from a specialization cycle.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all that. I think to kind of add on to one of your points, one thing I'm often bringing up with clients is I think it's also easy to get greedy when things are going well. Man, I'm feeling great. We're making very good progress right now. Cool, I feel so good. Let's do more. And we can progress even quicker. Where there's a time and a place where it might make sense for us to add more. But also a lot of times, man, our biofeedback is great. We're crushing and training. We feel good when we're going to the gym. We're making solid progress. That's oftentimes a good sign that we're doing exactly what we need to. And again, like more isn't always better. We can very easily exceed the amount that is actually productive for us and put us in a worse place. So I think that's just it's just speaks to the patience element of this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it is, hey, we just need to train together weeks and weeks, because it's oftentimes like, hey, we had a really good couple of weeks where we felt very good. We're progressing very well. Let's do more, right? Actually, we just need like months and months more like this to ultimately get to where you want to be.
Absolutely.
Selfishly, to kind of wrap this up, I'm curious how you're applying any of these strategies in your own training. I always love hearing what you're up to. Like be it high frequency, specializing in any specific body parts. Fill me in there.
Yeah, so Jeremiah, we have had many conversations over the years in terms of my training, and I do want to say that I probably have a little bit of a bias towards this type of approach just because I've been training so long that it's something that I've seen work for myself and work for many other clients. And at this point, I always have some degree of specialization or at least a bias in my training because I'm at the point in my lifting career where global growth comes slowly. So really the only way to meaningfully change my physique is to be more targeted with my approach. So right now I'm doing essentially, I'm not utilizing a specialization cycle, but if I was to look at the programming construction of what I'm doing, I am biasing more of my back, especially from width and thickness, and then my side delts. And at this stage of my training, because progress happens so slowly, I get far more return on investment by putting focus, volume, frequency, and recovery towards the areas that will create the biggest visual impact on my physique. So right now, like I said, my main emphasis, so if I was to say my primary focus, is on back width and thickness. And really, when it comes down to it, I'm approaching it the same way that I would for a client, especially an advanced client. I'm utilizing, for back specifically, I'm utilizing 2 training sessions per week. So I'm getting 2 exposures. I'm actually training between 20 to 24 total weekly sets, and that's split between width work and then thickness work. And then to manage fatigue, I rotate exercise categories across the week. So I have one day where I'll utilize heavier works in like the 6 to 10 rep range, and then one day where it's a more moderate load work, which is in like the 12 to 25 rep range. And this lets me hit back frequently without crushing my central nervous system or my low back with axial fatigue. So I'm not doing deadlifts and things like that. I'm not doing rack pulls. It's more so I'm utilizing pull downs, pull ups, machine pull downs. I'm utilizing rows, especially chest supported rows and different variations of that. I have a discrepancy in my left to right side. When I really go back and look at it, unfortunately, I never got this looked at. When I was competing, when I was like 22, I was after my first contest prep. I was hanging from a pull-up bar, and they had put weights on me for a photo shoot. So I was doing weighted pull-ups.
Oh,
No, it wasn't
I
a
thought you were
weighted
just
stretch,
gonna
but
say you're
essentially
doing like a DC stretch.
yeah, I wasn't particularly doing that on purpose, but it was for a photo shoot that they had me loaded with 3 or 4 45-pound plates. And it was essentially to almost look like I was going to be doing pull-ups with that. At that time, I don't think I could ever do. That would be 180 pounds plus my body weight of plus 200 pounds. So that'd be like 380-pound pull-ups. I could never do that. But just due to the loading parameters, I was up there for so long without straps that I ended up feeling a tear in my lat. Now, this is well over 10 years ago, and still the discrepancies are different. I don't have pain or anything like that, but I just think that there may have been scar tissue accumulation in that region. I'm actually looking around in the greater Nashville area for a body worker, but that's another topic for another day. But I will say that one thing that I am doing a lot more of is unilateral work, where I start with my weaker side, because my left side is just a bit weaker. And that could be from the lat injury that I had many years ago, or it could be due to the fact that I'm a righty and I have more right dominance on my right side. But I will utilize a lot of chest supported or very supported and stable movements that I'm also able to utilize unilateral setups with. And then my secondary focus is side delts. And that's another target area for me that I want to improve, because really when it comes down to it, every single person I know could use better side delts. It makes your entire physique look wider, more athletic, and more proportional. And then with delts, I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. I'm usually doing 3 to 4 exposures per week. I'm utilizing between 15 to 20 total weekly sets. I'm choosing nearly all exercises that are high stability and high stimulus fatigue ratio. I do a lot of like machine lateral raises, cable laterals, both in the short and length and bias. I do upright row variations, and then I do a lot of high rep pump work. That's not something that I would prescribe to everyone for every muscle, but I just find that higher rep work for delts in particular work very well for me, especially because it's a muscle group that it's a smaller muscle group. It's harder to actually get like pump and damage and disruption in that muscle group. So I really try to hit them with a higher frequency. I keep most of my sets, 0 to 1 rep in reserve, depending on what exercise it is. And then I will, take a lot of sets to the house in terms of like the isolation. So I do a lot of cable laterals, a lot of chest support laterals. I do prone incline lateral raises, a lot of variation within delts. So I probably utilize delts are probably the exercise, or the body part rather, especially side delts, that I utilize the most exercise variety in, but it's still in a well-constructed and structured manner where I'm going back week after week and trying to progress on those movements. I just tend to utilize a higher frequency, which then necessitates a higher, I don't want to say novelty, but higher variety in terms of exercise selection.
Okay, very interesting. You mentioned like working up to 25, like up to the 25
Mhm.
rep range a couple of times in this episode, and I know that's like a part of fortitude training as
It is.
well, as you mentioned earlier. Interesting. Not really something that I've passed like 15 reps, not something I really program a lot, but I can for sure see, especially with something like lateral raise, I can for sure see how there would be a lot of merit to that. I think that's probably something I'm going to start toying with a little bit more frequently.
I would definitely suggest it. I will tell you this. I did a mentorship with Chris Beardsley for over a year, and I had the utmost respect for Chris. I think he's a great mind, especially from a theory-based perspective. And he really got me into this. And this was before he had a podcast, and he wasn't, he didn't actually do any podcasts. That's why I hired him from a mentorship perspective. And he really got me into like that 5 to 8 rep range. That was before him and Paul Carter were discussing these things, at least openly. And I kind of got into this bias where I was like, why do I need high rep work? And it really came, I'm very fortunate that people in my corner, I have good people in my corner first and foremost, but I also have people that have different viewpoints. And Scott has always seen the benefit of utilizing higher rep ranges, especially from essentially an embracement of discomfort perspective, because when you have pushed yourself to failure at 25 reps, which is very difficult, there's a ton of metabolite buildup. There's a lot of, you have to get good at lactate clearance, and there's all these metabolic byproducts that are building up, and it's an immense amount of discomfort. It's much more uncomfortable than doing a 5 to rep, on max essentially. But Scott has always kept that in, and through many discussions with him, I was like, I'm going to go back to utilizing some of those things. So we were on a roundtable discussion last month, Jeremiah, with Jeff, our buddy, and I discussed how I was going back to some of the bodybuilding principles that I had, and that was something that I utilized. I utilized essentially daily undulating periodization, especially from a rep range perspective. So it's not that every muscle group is getting hit with 20 to 25 reps, but specific muscle groups that I either find that I've had a benefit or I like it from an enjoyment perspective, or muscles that I really need a better connection to. I will tell you, my lats in particular, I will hit sets of 20 to 25 on occasion on certain movements. And what I do, because there's this whole like dogma about fatigue accumulating and high reps, lowering motor unit recruitment and all these things. And if we actually look at like the research on motor unit recruitment, we do not see that as long as you get close to failure, you're going to have essentially motor unit firing, where initially in a high rep set, you're going to recruit your slow twitch muscle fibers, because it does not need to turn on high threshold motor units to lift a low load that you can do for high reps. But towards the end, if you look at the last 5 reps of a 25 rep max and the last 5 reps of an 8 rep max, they look the same. They look the same both in terms of execution, in terms of rep velocity, but they also look the same in terms of actually motor unit activation. So that's a little bit of tangent for another day, but I will tell you this. It helps me get a better mind to muscle connection because I'm flooding blood into that muscle. I'm getting much more nutrient delivery, and it's something I do like to utilize at the end of my session. So it isn't something that I would start out and just try to get this engorged pump. I don't think that that's advantageous, especially if I have more like quote unquote loading movements next. But what I will do is say that I'm doing upright rows for between sets of 6 to 10, then maybe my last movement for delts in that training session will be high rep laterals, or especially machine laterals, which have a lot of stability and it's very easy to pump out high reps. I might do 3 to 4 sets of 20 to 25 reps. And it's something that there's exercise variety in there, but also it allows me to get a ton of blood in that muscle. And it isn't something that is inducing a ton of damage. And I don't see it personally having overlap in terms of this, boogeyman of fatigue, which is causing me not to be able to train the rest of the session or the subsequent sessions that I have throughout that course of the week. So it's just some
Yeah.
food for thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even from a practical perspective, like, I mean, when I'm starting with a new client who doesn't move well, I'm always going to program like I'm gonna bias slightly higher rep ranges. Like, say I might want to bias like 5 to 10 once they get better at an RDL.
Mhm.
I might start them like 8 to 12
Absolutely.
because I
Practice.
don't want them to load this heavy. I want them, yes, I want more reps to practice it. And even like, but like side delts specifically, like so many people are like, man, I'm at the top pin for my lateral raises and I can still barely do my cable lateral raise, right? Like it's just, or like it's harder to progress in terms of load for a movement like that. It gives us a broader range there. Huh.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to think on that more in terms of how I could apply that. But that's
Also, one
really an interesting
application for
takeaway.
you that if you do apply this in practice, I would like you to go back and check for yourself is I found personally when I utilize, even if I go say, I utilize different incline pressing variations because no one, just like I said, no one has enough side delt. No one has enough upper chest. I've never, even working with competitors, I've never seen someone with an overly dominant upper pecs. So with incline movements, I utilize a 30-degree incline dumbbell press. I utilize a Smith machine press, and then I also use a hammer strength incline press. Well, in one of those movements, like I say, I undulate things in terms of rep ranges. I will at least do some of that work in the 20 plus rep range. It may be not to 25, but it may just be 20 plus. And so I get 20 and I might get 21 or 22 on the first set, and then I start seeing rep drop off. But within that, when I go back, especially if I utilize that movement for a mesocycle, and then I change the rep range and I keep that same movement, I go back down to say an 8 to 12 rep range or even a 6 to 10 rep range. I find that I'm not only stronger, but I'm better at handling those higher weights without having as much of a recovery cost. And I've also noticed that utilizing utilizing higher rep ranges, it almost, I don't want to say that it acts like cardio because that would be a misextrapolation of what it is actually doing, but I'm just more fit in general from a set to set perspective. I see less rep drop off. Another huge advantage, I utilize this a lot with women, is that there are many exercises that cannot be appropriately loaded for a woman as it can be for a man. So the greatest example of this is utilizing cable laterals. So it's not that I always program a woman at 20 to 25 reps initially, but I do have a lot of women that they could not make the jump, especially if it's a 5 or 10 pound increment on a movement, an isolation movement, especially a unilateral isolation movement like a cable lateral. So I may initially have them in the 10 to 12 rep range, but as they get stronger, they may be able to work up to 20 plus reps. And so that is something I never want people to look at rep ranges as black and white, like you can only do 6 to 12 reps, or you can only do, like there's a dogma right now of 4 to 8 reps. You never want to look at it like that. There are so many tools in the toolbox essentially that we can utilize. And I've seen a lot of great progress from people, especially from a joint and connective tissue perspective, utilizing higher rep ranges in terms of working around that so they don't have as much heavy loading on those joint and connective tissues. And then also another thing that factors into that is utilizing BFR with low loading. And oftentimes with BFR, if you actually look at the BFR protocols, it's a 30 rep buy-in set and then 3 sets of 15 reps. So it's still high rep work with low loads. I found that to be really advantageous for a lot of clients with joint connective tissue issues, tendon issues, working around injuries, where it's not this essentially on or off switch. It's not like, hey, I can train my arms or I can't because I have issues with tendon or a patellar issue, for your legs. We can really utilize different approaches. We may have a bias. I do like lower rep ranges to be able to really get strength progression and to really have something to shoot for from a progressive overload perspective, but I'm also not turning my brain off to higher rep work.
I love it. Yeah, no, that's as I was saying off air after our last episode. I love having these conversations with you because it always broadens my perspective and like I always gain some new insights. I was like, that's something that I didn't even realize I was so biased towards, but I could for sure like look at this through a broader lens.
Hell yeah.
So as we wrap this up, dude, any final thoughts you want to leave the listener with on specialization phases before we wrap it up?
Absolutely. So if we were to go back to the first part of this episode, the first thing you opened with was discussing genetics. And I think it's really important that before you assume that genetics are the root cause of you having lagging muscle group, you look at other aspects of your training. So this is what I would call a training audit. So you want to look at if you're actually doing and training those muscle groups in a way that would actually allow it to grow at a maximal rate. So are you giving it enough high quality weekly volume? Are you training it early in a session, not when you're already fatigued? Has load or reps progressed over the last 8 to 12 weeks? And is your execution actually targeting the tissue, or is it redistributing like the force and the actual mechanical tension to other muscles and essentially making them do the work? The other thing is you need to identify a real objective lagging muscle group. It really only makes sense to do specialization if you have 1 or 2 muscle groups that are truly behind the rest, because you want to be able to bring those muscles up to change your overall look. But if you're in 1 to 2 scenarios, which usually it's the latter or the former scenario, meaning if all of your muscle groups are lagging, you need more size everywhere. You don't need to specialize. So that's really something I try to get across to clientele. Even if you have, especially if someone comes to me and says, hey, I have these 6 lagging muscle groups, it's like your whole body's essentially lagging. So let's focus on more of a global perspective. And oftentimes with those individuals, this isn't to be discouraging. You can really get a lot of bang for your buck with a more balanced program. Then I also want to make sure, and this is something that I would suggest for anyone out there that's going to try this approach, you need to confirm that you have the recovery bandwidth. A specialization phase increases the workload on a target muscle. So you need to make sure that you have consistent sleep, you have solid nutrition, especially you really want to make sure you're ideally at least at maintenance or in a surplus. You want to have manageable stress and then the ability to recover from high frequency and high training volume. Other thing is, please do not make the mistake of trying to specialize on more than 2 muscle groups. For most lifters, 1 large muscle group like your back, your quads, or your glutes, or 1 large and 1 small muscle group would be very advantageous to approach. But anything beyond that, it's really going to diminish and hinder the results you can get from this. And then really a huge thing is to increase volume intelligently, not recklessly. what I would really suggest is a lot of the literature looks at volume increases of around 20%. So I really wouldn't exceed that. And what I would suggest is instead of just stacking on more volume on your existing sessions, is to raise your frequency. So for instance, if you are training a muscle group once per week, try twice per week. Or if you are looking at some of the frequency recommendations I made previously in the last episode, it would be 2 to 3 times a week for big muscles and then 3 to 4 times per week on smaller muscles. But also keep in mind that you need to reduce your non-priority muscles to maintenance volume. So you're not adding more sets to everything, you're reallocating your recovery budget. And this would be the best way to be able to ensure that you get the most return on investment from a specialization cycle.
I love it. This has been such a good conversation, man. I've taken so much from this. I'm sure the listener has as well. And it's been so fun to, again, just record with you again. We will
Hell
definitely be
yeah.
doing this a lot more in the future. Thank you, dude. Really, so
Absolutely.
insightful. I'm sure the listeners really enjoyed it as well. Before I let you go, just let everybody know again where they can find you and anything at all you want to plug.
Absolutely, my friend. So if you guys enjoyed the podcast and you guys have stayed with us for these 2 parts, please make sure to check me out at the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. I do weekly long form deep dives, and especially from an educational perspective on nutrition, metabolism, coaching, training. I'm going to be doing a lot more training content. I actually have the next 6 weeks built out. So there's a lot of
So,
training content coming out. So that's first and foremost. Secondarily, you guys can find me for daily content, especially from like an educational perspective on Instagram, which is at Brandon DaCruz _. And then if you're an intermediate or you're an advanced lifter or you're a coach yourself and you want someone to guide you through the process of becoming the best version of yourself, all I do is one-on-one coaching. So if you guys have any interest in that, please feel free to reach out to me. The best way to do so is at my email, which is bdacruz at gmail.com. bdacruzfitness at gmail.com. Sorry.
I'll get it right in the show notes. All that will be in the show notes. And again, couldn't recommend podcasts, following Brandon, and even working with Brandon. Again, you, dude, you've been, I think, one of the single biggest influences by far on my own coaching. So appreciate you, man. Thank you for
Absolutely.
being here.
I'm looking forward
And
to the
we will
next time.
catch you guys soon.
Peace.
Same. See you guys.